the Spanish state tries and control the mood of Catalan politics by implicitly stating that in case Catalans decided to become independent, they would use military force to stop us.
You must have what is a credible deterrent. Now, in the case of a country like Catalonia, hypothetically, an independent Catalonia would have to have a deterrent. You don't need, Catalan defense forces may not need to have everything to defend itself. It can rely on assets, military assets of the other NATO countries, particularly those in the same area.
El 2024 ha estat un any convuls en l'àmbit internacional. La continuació de les guerres d'Ucraïna i Rússia, la guerra d'Israel i Gaza, més els altres conflictes que continuen actius al món, l'elecció de Donald Trump als Estats Units, tots són circumstàncies que tenen un impacte directe en els països de la Unió Europea. Però la Unió Europea continua ofegada en debats que no semblen mai sortir a la llum d'una manera honesta i clara sobre el seu paper en aquest món de relacions internacionals, sobre la necessitat o no de tenir un sistema de defensa propi, sobre la manera com vol organitzar-se en l'escalada de tensions que hi pot haver els propers anys entre el món occidental i el món asiàtic. La independència de la Unió Europea respecte als Estats Units s'expressa també en qüestions de defensa i de geopolítica, en la seva intervenció en l'OTAN i en d'altres organismes multilaterals. Alhora, ja hem començat de fa mesos a reflexionar sobre aquestes qüestions i creiem que és molt important que a la política catalana hi hagi un canvi de rasant en la manera com s'adrecen aquestes qüestions. En comptes de fixar-nos en el moralisme o en actituds bonistes, creiem que hem de començar a parlar de manera pública i oberta, molt més socialitzada com en d'altres països, dels nostres interessos, de les nostres necessitats geopolítiques i no tant del bé i del mal, segons ens l'expressaríem en un confessionari. Per parlar d'això, avui tenim un convidat de luxe que es diu Dorcha Lee i que és un coronel retirat. De seguida el presentarem, però m'acompanyen per tenir aquesta conversa dues persones d'alhora. El Daniel Soler, que és professor de secundària i membre de la Societat d'Estudis Militars i membre de l'hora també, que ens ajuda a pensar aquestes qüestions des del grup de treball de Relacions Internacionals. I també tenim l'Elisabet Vives, que és consultora de polítiques públiques i investigadora al Regne Unit i que és membre del comitè polític de l'hora. Tots dos un luxe de tenir-los en aquesta conversa. Ara passaré la paraula a Elisabet Vives perquè ens presenti aquest convidat d'avui, el coronel Dorcha Lee.
Gràcies, Jordi. Com deies, hem convidat el coronel irlandès i diplomàtic Dorcha Lee. El coronel Lee, que avui està retirat de l'exèrcit, és un referent en l'anàlisi de polítiques de defensa a Irlanda, format a institucions educatives militars d'Irlanda, als Estats Units i França, va servir l'exèrcit irlandès, the Irish Defence Forces, durant 42 anys, sobretot al cos d'infanteria. Ha participat en 5 missions de pau de l'ONU, a Xipre, al Líban, a Síria, a Israel, a l'Iraq i a Somàlia, i ha estat observador militar en diversos conflictes. Ha participat en diverses missions d'observació electoral amb l'ONU, la Unió Europea i el Carter Center, i entre el setembre del 2008 i el setembre del 2010 va formar part de la missió de seguiment de la Unió Europea per supervisar la retirada de les forces russes després de la guerra del 2008 entre Geòrgia i Rússia. Ha escrit diversos llibres, entre els quals un llibre que va coautoritzar amb en Daniel, anomenat Política de Defensa i Estat Propi, informes, articles, entre els quals destaquen treballs sobre la defensa d'una Catalunya independent i sobre la defensa d'una Escòcia independent. Entre d'altres afiliacions, és membre associat de la Societat d'Estudis Militars.
Moltes gràcies. De cara als oients, informar-los que la resta d'aquest podcast es desenvoluparà en anglès, però estarà subtitulat en català perquè el pugueu seguir. Per tant, si l'esteu sentint per Spotify i l'anglès no és la vostra llengua de preferència, us convidem a desplaçar-vos a YouTube, on podreu seguir la conversa amb subtítols. Okay, thank you, Colonel Lee, for being here with us. Welcome to our podcast.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I'm very honored to be invited to make this podcast on behalf of your party.
The honor is ours. One first question, what is the conversation about defense that Europeans should be having that we are not having right now?
I think the conversation is about investing more in defence. The European investment in defence overall, we use European in the wider sense, is not up to what is required in these days. The main change, the war in Ukraine in particular, but other regional conflicts where European countries have participate, show that there's been a kind of a valley period where countries have not been investing. And I'm not talking about my own country, which has a very poor record on this area, but I'm talking about the mainstream countries like Germany and those who should have kept up with investment and didn't. So this has always caused some tension between Europe and the United States, who are essentially providing the nuclear umbrella, and also paying an awful lot more on defense than we do. And the Americans have other interests now in Asia and so on, and Europe has to stand up and take charge itself.
What would change if investment in the military or in defense increased in the countries of the European Union?
I think first of all, like at the moment, the war in Ukraine is driving the agenda, and unfortunately, that's the way it is. But we have to consider how the outcome of the war in Ukraine. If there is an ending which shows an advantage or a gain for Russia, then it will encourage Russia possibly to take on and try to restore its influence or control in other parts of Europe. Now, that is the thing. If on the other hand, there is a complete liberation of Ukraine, there opens up a possibility for working out some kind of a better peace arrangement. But there's also this other factor that there's a new American president, well, an old new American president coming along, and whose decisions will make a huge difference to this debate.
I want to come back to this later, and before I give the mic to my friends and colleagues, I asked Daniel, what is the main disagreement between you two? And he said that you think that if Catalan pro-independence movement was determined to follow through with its goals, at the end of the day, the Spanish state would behave rationally, and at least rationally enough, and we are not to fear escalation of military violence in the case of exercising self-determination in Catalonia. Can you explain this to us, please?
Well, if you've used a key word here, deterrent, and if I may elaborate on that, and you can see it. Every nation, sovereign, independent nation, needs to have a deterrent. In other words, in fact, all policies, if it's not even written there, it's based on the fact that you have armed forces to defend your country, at least to the extent to make it too costly for, we say, a neighbor or any country to attack or invade. That is the principle of deterrence. And if you have, then peace will continue. But of course, if there's a challenge, that deterrent then has to be effective. Otherwise, the whole thing doesn't work. But the deterrent principle is there, and you can judge and make out a formula as to what level of defence is necessary to establish that. And you need to have a defence, ideally across all spectrums of war: land, sea, air, cyber, and space. So it's the deterrent is the key thing. If you do not have that, it's like, for instance, on your street, you lock your doors at night, you may have a burglar alarm system or a dog, you may have some form of security, but the house that has no security, that doesn't invest in it, hasn't a deterrent, that will be the one that will be broken into. And it's the same internationally. The weak military countries and history down the line has shown that. So you must have what is a credible deterrent. Now, in the case of a country like Catalonia, hypothetically, an independent Catalonia would have to have a deterrent too. It has to have armed forces. It can't say opt out and say, okay, we won't have an air force, but we will have an army, or vice versa. There are different. The stool, the legs, 3 legs on the stool, at least have to, or you can't sit down otherwise. So you have this kind of interaction. But what constitutes a deterrent is approximately investing in percentage of GDP the same. This is a very rough way of doing it, but it's in fact the most universally understood one, that if you invest a certain amount of money, now how you invest it, yes, it's of course interest, would influence things. I don't want to talk about my own country very much because we do not meet the deterrent principle under any heading. And one of the things I have advised on that is that in that case, then the easiest thing for us is to concentrate on one particular area. And cyber warfare is an area. Most countries have cyber defense, but cyber offensive capability is a deterrent. And but you must have a credible cyber defense first set up before you get into the idea of a cyber offensive capability. But if you have the ability to totally destroy the economy, the system of your enemy by cyber, yeah, that's a credible deterrent. And it is an option. But like these deterrents only last for a while, and I'll finish my point by saying that it's just at this point in time that the cyber warfare thing is probably the number one threat. But any day now, they will invent some way of locating a cyber attack in real time. And when that particular point actually happens, and with the capability to deal with it, then the cyber threats will all disappear overnight. Not quite, but they will be of less importance. But at the moment, all countries are very vulnerable to the cyber thing, and the deterrent in that area is a game. That's sorry, it's a wrong.
No, that's
too badly.
It was very clear. I wanted to hear Danny or Daniel on this.
Well, I think we can agree that the strategic environment of Catalonia and Ireland are very different. Mostly Irish airspace is controlled by the British military, and so focusing the invest in only cyber defense is a possibility for Ireland, but given the strategic environment of Catalonia in the Mediterranean, and which is a quite unstable area, and also given that supply lines, both for example, fuel or even food, arrive to Catalonia by sea, what do you think that the strategic focus should be for a independent Catalonia defense policy?
I think, first of all, cooperation with your neighbours. And that applies, by the way, to Ireland. And I would not say, you just say that the British can patrol our waters. They don't have the right to patrol complete. They can move in and out of the waters. But the territorial waters of Ireland are the responsibility of Ireland to monitor. And we certainly have a problem with transatlantic cables, the threat to transatlantic cables. We also have some gas and oil rigs and wind farms off sea, which need protection. The west coast of Ireland, our naval service is not yet able to provide the protection. In the Irish case, we have to point out huge difference, is that our sea area is 7 times larger than our land mass. That does not apply in the case of Catalonia. In the case of Catalonia, you should see things mostly integrating your forces along with the neighbouring forces. Spain and France are obvious ones. And the question then arises whether you should join them in a military alliance or not. That's a political question, but it is very much in your case. The other thing that is different about the Mediterranean is that the Mediterranean is a very calm compared to the west coast of Ireland or the Atlantic. So the naval assets that you need do not necessarily have to be ocean going. I mean, you can, the actual ships that you use in the Mediterranean, mostly they're not up to the same standard as would be used for Atlantic operations. That having been said, if Catalonia were an independent country participating in international peacekeeping missions or peace enforcement missions, its naval forces would also have to be ready to participate in missions in the Atlantic and anywhere where there would be cooperation, particularly if it's done by NATO, but also even in UN peacekeeping, this would arise. But I think the strategic issue is being a part of alliance. If you are part of an alliance, there is a lot of help and cooperation can happen there. If you're not, then you're going to have to provide absolutely everything to go it alone. If you decide to go it alone completely, you'll have what we call here the miniature army. You have to have all the elements necessary to survive.
So NATO has currently 32 members. Its most recent ones are Finland and Sweden, who joined in 2023 and 24 respectively, clearly driven by Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And among other things, NATO has this commitment that all members should devote 2% of the GDP to defense and military spending, as you've referred to earlier. However, Ireland is not part of NATO. It's one of the 4 EU members that are not part of NATO, alongside Cyprus, Malta, and Austria, if I'm correct. So my first question is, why is Ireland not part of NATO, and what are your views on this?
I think, first of all, historical. In the First World War, we lost 48,000 men were killed in a war that didn't involve us, really. It was the British war and Germans, Continentals. This bore deep. The Irish people took that loss. And when we became independent, there was determination not to get involved in wars. Now, by 1939, when the war broke out, we made a decision to be neutral in that war. And that war was ended. And at the end of that war, we were lucky to remain neutral and not involved in the war. We certainly increased our defence forces and all of that. So it would have been a difficult country to conquer. But at the same time, we were very vulnerable. We didn't have much air power. But we came out of it. So the people feel that by being neutral, we stayed out of the war. But that isn't really why. It was a combination of factors that we survived, a combination of factors that Sweden stayed out of the war as well, and Spain as well. So, but then when you look at it then from then on, the Cold War situation, we were ideologically with the West, but politically and militarily, we had decided to continue with this neutrality thing. And it did preside, the Irish Defence Forces took part in so many peacekeeping missions. Because we were neutral, we were very acceptable. And because of that, the neutrality gained a kind of, it's almost impossible for an Irish politician to recommend ending neutrality. But times are changing. The war in Ukraine, we have been reinterpreting our neutrality. We've given a lot of help to Ukraine, military help, but non-offensive equipment, but at the same time, pretty solid help. But at the same time, I'm just saying, to answer your question, essentially, it's become a political issue that if one side of the House recommends ending neutrality, the other will make political capital out of saying no. And they will point back towards history, saying we kept out of World War II and all the rest of it. So, but I think the attitudes are changing. We can cooperate with NATO. We are in NATO's partnership for peace, and that. Personally, I feel in the long run we really should, because we had 20 years ago, when I was military representative in Brussels, the common security and defence policy was being developed, which would lead to a common defence. But that never really happened. And NATO still actually holds the primary responsibility for the security and defence of Europe. So it makes sense that the countries would be in that situation. And there are other issues as well. I think, I don't know whether I mentioned you, but those 4 countries that you mentioned, each has a different situation. Cyprus is willing to join NATO if Turkey agrees, and there are signs that this will happen in time, and that makes sense. In the case of Austria, it's in its constitution, and it's very difficult to change constitution. Austria is very dependent on oil and gas from Russia, and so the relationship there, and also that constitutional guarantee was forced on the Austrian people as a condition for the Russian withdrawal from Austria at the end of the Second World War. So Malta is in a different situation, but it is measuring up towards NATO standards. And it has been tested by NATO inspection teams, see that their armed forces are there. And so you can see that there's a possibility for Malta eventually. But essentially, the idea of being neutral, once Sweden and Finland left, the whole thing collapsed. The Swedes were, and the Finns were, the 2 leading countries who had militarily met the international standards, and we followed them. But Ireland would probably be politically the last country, to join NATO if it comes to that. But the outcome of the Ukrainian war will do that. And if I may speculate on this, because it's President Trump's return back, he has undertaken to end this war, and there are 3 ways he can do it. He can follow the example of President Ronald Reagan and escalate the support to the Ukrainians and drive the Russians out of all Ukrainian internationally recognized territory, including Crimea. That's one attitude he could take. Like Reagan used the Star Wars thing, the Strategic Defense Initiative, and the Russians realized that they couldn't keep the arms race going and they were going to lose out. The second thing is he could appease Putin and agree that parts of Ukraine would be ceded to Russia. And he could do that very easily by simply reducing military aid to Ukraine. But there is a third option that might happen. Trump has made it clear, his ambivalent attitude towards NATO. And in his first time, he actually set up a study group to examine the implications of the United States withdrawing from NATO. He has a good rapport with Putin. They seem to have a certain amount of commonality, an attitude. And my third idea is, in fact, would be a kind of reversal back to the spheres of influence situation created after the Yalta Agreement in 1945. And that in that particular stage that Trump and Putin will make a deal. And that will eventually unravel NATO. And but the end result is a possible situation where the European Union's common defence will eventually happen, and it will become the dominant element here, and then NATO would then become a bridge between America and Europe, an overriding organization. But there'll be treaty changes before that. That's not immediate. But I'm just saying that the outcome of this Ukrainian war and how it's handled is decisive and will answer most of the questions that are in your minds.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, actually, I had a question about this topic, about the topic of all the tensions between NATO and growing or not yet grown EU common security and defense policy. But a debate has been going about the tension, or I may say inside the countries which are both NATO member states and European Union member states, the perspective of the growing or really the actual setting up of the European Union common security and defense policy has been creating some kind of debate or friction inside the maybe not political, not military, but inside the political establishments about what would happen if Trump really gets out of the United States out of NATO, and what is the role of the European Union common security and defense policy? Can you comment on that?
Yes, I think it was envisaged that the European common security and defense policy would evolve and would eventually become a common defense, and the steps were taken to enhance military capability. They were called PESCO was one, European Defence Agency. Various cooperative efforts and enterprises and projects have been happening since then, but nothing on a really big scale. In the case of the problem really in a way is that you have to ask the question, does anyone want Europe to become a nuclear defended area? Really, we have the French and the British have small nuclear capabilities, which would be nationally important deterrents, but wouldn't really be anything near what would be required to stand up to Russia, and because the Russians have kept this capability and diversified it. So we have this situation that, in my view, we've always, those of us who worked on this thing back in Brussels in those days, we saw eventually that there would be a joining up or an overlap, and the overlap would be complete. More than likely that it would be, but we didn't envisage the Ukrainian war. And when I mention the Ukrainian thing, in the third scenario, you have to remember Moldova and Georgia. So you see the possibility of a neutral buffer zone being created there. All three countries then being pressured to withdraw their applications to join the EU and NATO. So, but that's the fairly extreme option. But I mentioned it there because there were three broad options that I see in relation to what President Trump will do. There is another aspect as well too, that for many, many years, the Americans have been trying and failing to get Europe to increase its defense spending. And the reason that there's the overlap, it goes back to the very first meeting in Reykjavik in the autumn of 73 with President Nixon and President Pompidou. And Nixon tried really hard. He threatened to withdraw the 250,000 American troops from Europe if there wasn't. But he wasn't looking for an increase in defense spending in Europe. He wanted trade arrangements between America and Europe. And Pompidou pointed out that trade was a matter for the then EEC, now the EU, and NATO was the forum for defense. And you cannot put the two on the same agenda. And then when Ireland was the only neutral country at that stage, neutral aligned in the European Union. But very shortly afterwards, Finland, Sweden, and Austria joined. So there were four countries. It would have made it even more difficult to discuss both items quid pro quo. So then it reverted back to the NATO pressure to increase the spending. And that will be, we know that already President Trump has suggested a 5% new levy, new defense target. Secretary General Mark Rutte of NATO has talked about 2.5% to 3%, but that's about what's going to happen. And I know our people are increasing defence spending, but we're increasing it from such a low base and we are prioritizing the threat, the maritime threat. But we won't get there in any meaningful time.
On this, can I continue on the issue of NATO? Is it even possible, though, to conceive of a common security and defense policy in the EU when you have countries like Hungary that seem to be willing to cut bilateral deals with Russia on their own, and then you have Turkey, which is part of NATO but not part of the EU, but still a very key actor in the Mediterranean? I don't know, like I don't really see the possibility of even the willingness to change the treaties of the EU, since you need unanimity for that.
Sorry, I think it's easier for countries like Hungary and those to, they've already signed the Treaty of European Union. They've signed up to the idea of European Common Security and Defence Policy, plus which may in time lead to a common defence. They've already agreed in principle to that. They've already joined NATO. They haven't left NATO. We understand the as again, I come back to it because this is another impact of the war in Ukraine. If that war ends, it's how it ends will dictate whether there will be, shall we say, a new movement within the European Union to go forward and make common defence happen or not. But it will be influenced on that because, and it is the power balance that will be there when this war is over. If Putin gains large areas of Ukraine, his agenda then, sooner or later, this will put terrible pressure on NATO. In other words, NATO cannot defend countries unless they're actually members of NATO. So Hungary is fine. Hungary, when anyone attacks Hungary, NATO will come to itself. I would worry about the Baltic states simply because it's so easy for Russia to overrun Lithuania in particular. It didn't happen within hours. And but even there, the NATO reaction has been to put a lot more NATO troops into the Baltic states, and that means that it will be internationalized. So Russia couldn't overrun these states without coming into military contact with American, what are the nationalities are there? British, French, and indeed the other smaller countries. So, but the question has always been in the back of our minds, way back, would the Americans really risk a nuclear war in Europe to defend a European country? And the official answer is yes, yes, yes. But, risking a nuclear annihilation just to save a couple of square miles of terrain by the Baltic, I don't know. I mean, we don't know the answer to that. And well, of course, the answer is if NATO doesn't respond, if it's attacked, then NATO disintegrates as an organization. Then you have the fallback position of the European common defense. That's the way I see it.
Okay. In your paper, Defending an Independent Catalonia, which can be found in the Societat d'Estudis Militars website, by the way, you recommended that an independent Catalonia to join all those international organizations such as the European Union and NATO, both. Here in Catalonia, I may say a lot of people, I don't know if most people, well, we have been conducting these polls about if an independent Catalonia should join NATO, and for the last 10 years maybe, and always the result is that the majority of people would like to an independent Catalonia to join NATO, but a lot of people do not know the implications, and some of them even think that you can be part of NATO just by paying a fee, just like being a member of a club, and other countries would defend with their military capabilities. And I would like you to comment about the implications of joining an alliance such as NATO for an independent Catalonia.
If I understand you right, Danny, you're saying what would Catalonia be expected to do if it were to join NATO?
Yes.
In a sense, yeah, right. Well, the thing is that if Catalonia is a member of NATO, then it opens up possibilities of cooperation. You don't need, Catalan defense forces may not need to have everything to defend itself. It can rely on military assets of the other NATO countries, particularly those in the same area. It is, if you take it like countries like Luxembourg, which is a small country. Luxembourg does not have an air force. It doesn't need a navy, but doesn't have an air force. But it still invests in air assets, which are being used by the Dutch. So it's paying its way there. And likewise, I think it's cooperating with the Belgians on a naval transport ship as well. But what it is doing is making financial contributions there, but not actually providing the assets. But the thing is that the whole idea is that you may be able to do another thing that has happened is that the air defense of Netherlands and Belgium, there's bilateral agreements between the two that they don't necessarily have to keep interceptor aircraft. These are very tiny airspaces compared to Ireland, because we have massive airspace because of our waters, our territorial waters. And so, but in the case of there's cooperation going on like that. I saw a Norwegian friend of mine was very happy when Sweden and Finland joined NATO. He said, because now we can think in terms of Scandinavian defence. And he was saying that the air program, air defense, would be maybe dominated by Sweden. It has fighter jets and sort of that. The Norwegians have naval capability, and Finland would have land capabilities, and even Iceland would be a great place to put our submarine pens. So there's thinking going on that there's cooperation. It opens up levels of cooperation. For us in Ireland, it means we probably wouldn't have to have, an air defence system as such. We would integrate and plug into a NATO air defence system. But that's a long way off. But the talk is going on that. In the case of Catalonia, again, you don't necessarily then maybe need to have an aircraft carrier or submarines. Although, again, if you have a naval deterrent, these are very important assets in that area. But smaller navies don't need to have that much. If Catalonia stands on its own, then it will obviously have to spend an awful lot more in defence to provide the level of security that it would require. So there's pluses and minuses. On the other hand, if you join NATO and NATO goes to war, your troops have to go and join as well. I mean, that's the commitment of Article 5 in a nutshell. This is that's the drawback, and that's why many Irish people don't want to join NATO, because all they see is body bags, And indeed, in World War I, they didn't even bring the bodies home; they were buried, left there on the continent. This is, but at the same time, at the moment, NATO is providing a level of security, and it has done so. And whereas we all thought that when the Cold War ended, that NATO would fade away, it didn't. It has a new purpose. And so I think, but I do not believe in it that doctrinally, that we should we should do what is practical and pragmatic. If it's pragmatic for us to join NATO, then we should do so. But there are people who disagree with me completely on that. They see it as a matter of moral dogma that we would not be a member of a military alliance. In fact, some of these people would probably join the Warsaw Pact if we were still around.
I want to run something through you. Something that we're seeing in Ukraine and also we're seeing in Gaza is that, but we also saw this in Afghanistan and in Iraq to some extent, is that the nature of asymmetric wars, as we're seeing them right now, makes it very difficult for any great power to really, dominate a people or a country that fiercely fights for their independence. This framework, I would say, leads me to ask you two questions. I know that asking two questions is an invitation for you to speak for 3 hours, like I would like to speak, but I'm going to risk the long answer. One is regarding our situation. The Spanish state tries and control the mood of Catalan politics by implicitly stating that in case that Catalans decided to become independent, they would use military force to stop us. There's a debate among pro-independence organizations whether this is a real threat or just a threat to deter our goals. But at the level of the military difficulty of subjugating a society such as ours, isn't this moment in military warfare in which asymmetric warfare is usually ends with the defeat of the regular army, the greater country, and the if Pyrrhic, but victory of the weakling or the insurgent army. Doesn't this situation make it more difficult for these threats to be credible? That's one. And the second question, let's answer this question first, and then I'll ask you the other one, which is also complicated.
Well, if I say the asymmetrical threat, yes, but I think you might as well widen it fully because it is hybrid warfare. We're in the time of hybrid warfare, which is much wider than just the asymmetrical threats of force. Mm-hmm. But when you include, and you have to include, the other domains of war, information war, economic warfare, political warfare, lawfare, and so on, right across the spectrum, that you can win and achieve. These support the military effort. That's the concept of it. And the Russians have developed this hybrid warfare thing quite a lot. It's invested an enormous amount into developing its cyber warfare capability for a start, and it's testing and trying out Western systems. And if you can achieve a lot of damage that way. The asymmetrical thing, the terrorism thing, this can be kind of contained, or you can live with it and carry on. That's the way. Now, Gaza, you mentioned, is a case in point. The thing about Gaza, and I've been writing about this in Irish papers since this particular round. Actually, I wrote about it before the previous rounds of fighting in Gaza as well. But you have a situation here where the information war being conducted by Israel is certainly winning for the home audience, but it's losing for the international audience. You're losing the kind of support. Now, that is the problem, that to try to win on both fronts. Militarily speaking, which the Secretary General of the UN has criticised the way they've conducted the war. They have maximised they go for what's called minimum risk. And in doing so, standing back and using airstrikes and artillery and tanks against, in a densely populated area, the percentage of civilian casualties is absolutely off the Richter scale, completely. You can only justify it in terms of the fact the Israelis don't want any of their soldiers to be killed. But even so, they may lose on the political war. And then you have the economic war as well. But at the same time, it's very difficult to defeat Hamas. And by the way, senior Israeli generals that have said this from the word go. So there's a debate going on in there. They're not at all convinced that this will go. But the other thing is, in fact, now the issue of bringing back settlements, increasing settlements on the Golan Heights in the West Bank area. Their agenda is to build up their population, and they do not feel secure unless they can continue to do that, which is the driving force behind the settlements. But the point is that it's not just a military thing; it is a hybrid thing, and the asymmetrical side of it, yeah. Sure, the Hamas attack on the 8th of October of last year was, or the year before last now, the way it is. That is an example of how, with very limited resources, a spectacular defeat can be waged on the Israelis. On the other hand, there's a lot more to that than just what I said. But we are living in this time, and you use the different levers which are appropriate at a certain time. And I was mentioned Russia in this one because the thing about it is that General Gerasimov, who was their chief of general staff, Gerasimov toured the West before over the years. He's fairly well known, and he was kind of twisting around hybrid war, meaning that it's a reversal of the Clausewitzian idea. And in other words, instead of military action to achieve a political aim, he was talking about political action to achieve a military aim. And he measured that as being a ratio of 4-1 against the military effort. Which is, by the way, maybe part of the reason why the Russians failed in their military operation at the beginning of the operation in Ukraine. They put in less assets into that than Saddam Hussein did in attacking Kuwait in 1990, and I was a witness to that.
But on the other hand, while we're seeing that the asymmetrical wars are also a play on politics and who gets to win the perception of public opinion and all that, so you may be losing the war on the ground, like Hamas is doing to some extent, but you may be winning the war, in the public square, so to speak. But the war in Ukraine, on the other hand, has brought back the war of two states just fighting, I would say, a regular or a traditional war, which was something that for decades, since Iraq and Afghanistan wars, the State Department in the US were developing rules of engagement that were based on guerrilla warfare or insurgent warfare and all that. And then suddenly we're back to that. Is the emergence of China as a military power opens the door for, again, having the kinds of wars that, state versus state and great armies fighting against each other?
Well, I think if first of all, if you listen to all the American commentators on both sides of the Democrats and Republicans, their great fear and worry is China. And they also couldn't be bothered with Europe. And the message was, Europeans, you look after your own place there. In fact, as far back, the pivot towards Asia, that had already begun when I was in Brussels. And they felt that they needed to be strong in Asia, and that China was rising, that China would eventually have the capability to take Taiwan back. And they didn't want to lose that. It's a thriving democracy. So that is really that is so. And you will find conventional naval wars maybe in the Far East. That will happen. You can see that happen, not quite like the thing. But remember, the one thing, when we talk about, remember the Vietnam War, the American phase of the Vietnam War. Yeah. They were militarily winning on the ground, but they lost the battle of the hearts and minds of the American people.
Exactly.
That's where they lost. They lost the war.
Yeah.
This is a profound message for the Americans. Understood that. That was why it's not easy to understand.
But did they? So, because now when we're seeing on the news that say the Taliban regime in Afghanistan are doing a more cruel enforcement of the rules against women's freedoms and all that, isn't that the outcome of the sense of security that they get from the idea that the US can no longer launch the kind of attack that they did in the beginning of the century, because these kinds of wars can no longer be won in Vietnam, in Algeria, in Iraq, in anywhere, in Gaza, anywhere. Nobody wins asymmetrical wars anymore.
Look, there's always checks and balances in this. I think that if you start out right, you want to say you're talking about asymmetrical war. Take Iran, and it has these private proxy wars, which are nearly always asymmetrical. They're not stand-up fights, conventionally speaking, and they got away with it for quite a long time, and then it don't get away with it because at the moment they're on the back burner. There's not much future for Hamas or Hezbollah or the Houthis in Yemen. That will be borne true in time. So, which then weakens Iran. But then Iran has it's a question of whether they do get a really serious deterrent. If they do develop the nuclear weapons, then that will also affect the balance of military power in that region. But I think that we're all sorry. Just to finish the point.
Yeah, please.
It was a conventional war that Russia launched on Ukraine, well flagged. And in the beginning, it was a form of proxy war with the little green men being infiltrated into the Donbass area back in, before.
2014, 2000.
But at the same time, then they moved forward to the conventional war. But at the same time, they underestimated completely the problem of toppling the Ukrainian regime and are gaining control of the country. But what they are doing at the moment, for instance, attacking infrastructure, this is really seriously damaging to Ukraine. And in my view, that only that the Americans, or those, if they want to go the other way around, they should give Ukraine the capability of inflicting similar damage on Russian infrastructure. So I was saying that I've talked about this question of supporting Ukraine.
Yep.
The first thing is air defense for Ukraine, and everyone agrees with that, and air superiority locally for their ground military operations. And then the other thing would be an offensive capability to increase the capability. While their power stations are being knocked out, that they could knock out some Russian ones too. That means giving intermediate ballistic missiles to the Ukrainians. So this is the kind of thing. But as I said, Mr. Trump will reveal all as to what it is, and we kind of have to live with that. It's I don't think that I'm not being defeatist or anything like that, but we're all caught into that. As you say, if every country were to say in Europe, we don't give a rat's tail what's happening in Ukraine would collapse. Countries do care and do want Ukraine to survive. And so, I don't know, but we'll see.
We have to, this is the beginning of the end of the conversation, but I want to say one last thing. More than 7 years after the failed independence attempt in Catalonia, the mood for many people is low. But your view is optimistical in the long run. And I think that's hopeful for all of us. So I would like to ask you two things. One is, why are you optimistical in the long run? And second, one of the few things that we've gained from this disappointment is that many people who were maybe facing the question of geopolitics with more of a moral understanding than a political or interest-based one, now are beginning to wonder whether their views up until that point were too naive or too jejune. So if someone, after listening to this conversation, decided to try and begin to understand better how we should conduct ourselves in the arena of defense or military strategy or geopolitics, would you suggest a reading, a book, something they can start with to change their minds and to learn better how to defend ourselves in this world of ours?
Well, it's a big question. And I kind of see if I can approach an answer in this particular way. If Catalonia aspires to be an independent state, it has to take the responsibilities of being a sovereign independent state. So it has to face issues such as defense. And then it has to face issues as to whether it will do it on its own or in cooperation with neighboring countries. Now, cooperation with Spain, cooperation with France. Cooperation is probably best affected by being a member of NATO and then working within NATO deals with Spain and France. But the point is, at the moment, you're not an independent state. So we have to look at this. People who aspire to be independent must know the responsibilities that will go with it for being independent. On the other hand, they shouldn't lose hope because of current setbacks in the political movement towards independence. Same in Scotland as well, too. In my view, and I've always stated this, I'm totally opposed in the case of the Catalan conflict or the Scottish conflict for armed rebellion against the colonial power. Sorry, maybe that's a bit
that's
too
very precise.
Okay, what I'm saying is I'm against that, but the point I'm saying is if there is a sufficient degree of democracy, a sufficient degree, not a perfect democracy, to work within this system, and if policies, the parties that have been formed in both countries develop good policies, what you can do now at this stage, before it happens, you develop good policies and you convince the people of that. That is the way forward, which is also important why there should be a diversification of independence movements in both countries. It is not really on the cards for the SNP to just be the standard bearer for independence. The funny thing is SNP has lost an awful lot of ground. Their two leaders have been seriously discredited. Their two historical leaders have been discredited. But there's the same percentage of people want an independent Scotland, but they are people who would vote for Labour, for the Greens, for Liberal Democrats, for other independence groups. So, but what I'm saying is that there is the diversification, because you need all elements of society to want independence for it to happen. The second thing you have, the challenge, is convincing sufficiently Spanish public opinion on the need to revisit the whole relationship between Catalonia and Spain. And that all I can say on that one is that I've always had faith in the younger people. They travel more, they listen more, they're open to ideas and to traditional enemies. The older people have longer memories, and maybe that's not good. But as I see it, and I see it here in Ireland, certainly in my lifetime, a massive change towards the British. For example, which were our traditional enemy, and there's no way that we see ourselves really in conflict with them anymore. And I've seen a lot of concessions that the British have made, which was not necessarily made by force, but by persuasion. And so I'm just saying, and each time it's maybe 3 steps forward and 2 back. So it is a form of movement towards independence by escalating, but it's an escalation. It is slow, and it will take time, and there will be many setbacks. But if the key thing is to have the information, to have the policies there, and to sell your policies and say, look, this would work better if we had more control, or that. So what I'm just saying is that in that context, you come back and say, well, would they be willing to pay for defense? And I think that they would. They'd have to, because if they don't do that, then Catalonia will become a basket case on the Mediterranean, overrun by Russian mafia or whatever. Oh, I don't know. I'm just suggesting that these are fears that others have talked to me about, unionists as well as nationalists in Catalonia. But it's there, and if it's the national thing, I'm an outsider with sympathies. to give that view.
Yeah.
Well, my own area of expertise is military, and that may be very limiting.
I think your view from the outside is very refreshing, and you certainly are an insider in our hearts, so that's a good thing. With this, we're going to conclude this conversation. We are very grateful for your presence here. We hope we can have another conversation in person sometime in the future when you come and visit us in this corner of the Mediterranean. Thank you very much, Coronel Lee. Thank you, Daniel Soler. Thank you, Elisabet Vives. This is Ensems, el podcast de l'Hora.
Thank you very much for the invitation to address you, and I wish you all the best of luck.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.